We are finished now with Part 8, Bill, and you've been here working away at this and doing these various modules. The title of it was Creating Modern China, the Birth of a Nation, and you began with foreign models. And it seemed to me always that I had thought of foreign models as issues like constitutionalism or socialism or fascism, these isms.
Right.
But it struck me that in Part 8, you've actually meant more than that kind of ism as a foreign model.
Right.
More than ideology.
So what are the choices facing modern China? The empire is gone. China, a new country on the ruins of the empire, but also on the foundations of Chinese civilization. What are its choices? The argument here is that these choices for most of the 20th century really are to be found abroad and not at home. And so we talked first about foreign models in the form of constitutionalism and the failed effort during the Yuan Shikai period, the first experimentation with socialism during the period of the 1920s and the communist effort to really rally workers and others in the cities in concert with the Soviet Union and to be crushed at that point by the nationalists. And then the flirtation with fascism, one of the more alluring isms of the late 1920s and early 1930s around the world, not just in China, but ultimately to be rejected also. But then looking at other forms in which modern China has been remade by choosing from among a menu of international options. So the modern military as perhaps the most important or one of the two most important professions in shaping modern China. The modern engineer and the physical remaking of China in a way that begins to be planned in the 1920s, but is visible to anyone who visits China today. And the idea that one can change from top down to make a modern country, change the culture of a country. Something
so this is sort of the notion of a top-down revolution.
A top-down revolution in culture. And so we've looked at these broad themes across the 20th century and into the 21st and haven't done a straight narrative walkthrough of the Republican period.
I noticed actually that when Bill was doing this, one of the things that learners sometimes commented on was, I'm a bit confused about where are we chronologically. But I guess the point was that these were themes that crossed
That's right.
the 1949 boundary.
But we recapture the chronology at this point in talking about the nationalist regime at the end, its alliance with the United States, the central and devastating effect of the Japanese invasion on the course of modern Chinese history, leading to the foundation of the People's Republic in 1949. But I think one of the things that one should think about in this, and think of the period that we're ending here before, and the pre-communist period, the period of the Republic of China on the mainland. When I was a student, again a student of John Fairbank, and when Fairbank would write about this, he would talk about the Republic as a kind of an interregnum, a place of the sets of experiments, all of which fail, leading to the success of the Chinese Communist Party.
That was very much his view, wasn't it?
It was a very common view in the 1960s and 70s. And yet, as we look back today on this period, at least there are many who would argue that the great exception in modern Chinese history isn't the period of the failed republic, but of the Maoist experiment from 1950 to 1976, because the China that Deng Xiaoping, and this is getting ahead of the game.
It is getting ahead of the game.
But just a moment.
Okay.
But the China of Deng Xiaoping is in many ways reminiscent of the China of Chiang Kai-shek.
Wow.
That is to say, authoritarian government, mixed economy, a foreign policy of multiple allies or alignments, but a much looser hand over the family, over society than would be found at the height of the Maoist period.
We're going to
and focused above all on economic development.
We're actually going to get to that
later on.
In the next part of the course. But I did have one last thing to ask you about.
Yeah.
When you talked about these Western isms that come in and Western practices or international practices, but some of them, they exist in Japan too by this point. Confucianism seems to be out of the picture. But then I look at Xi Jinping today.
Yes.
in October 2014, visiting the Confucian Temple, talking about the role of Confucianism as something that's international, saying that as Confucianism becomes international, it's important that China control the discourse of Confucianism. Where does this fit in?
This is actually also reminiscent in many ways of the nationalist period, because, of course, it was liberal intellectuals like Chen Duxiu and others, whom our learners have read, who denounced Confucianism as part of the bad old culture holding China back. And yet, the leaders of the country, Yuan Shikai first, Chiang Kai-shek, they embrace at least the symbols of this tradition as a means of having order in society. And Chiang Kai-shek reads the classics every day.
So he says.
So he says. No, it seems to be quite true, actually.
Oh, wow.
And the New Life movement, his cultural revolution, is a merger of ancient Chinese traditions, in particular Confucianism, with modern military and other ethics that are international in form. Mr. Xi Jinping seems to think that Confucianism is for China alone. I wonder what our learners would think of that.
It's a good question to ask them. But we're not going to ask you now, because we're actually going to bring part 8 to a close. And along the way, I wanted to thank you very much, by the way, for those of you who in the spring and summer sent contributions to HarvardX and for our work on China. And we hope you will consider doing it again, too.
Indeed. Thank you, and we'll see you very shortly in Communist China.